The Syria peace talks are not going as well as planned. The Syrian lead negotiator has criticized the main opposition High Negotiations Committee, the HNC, for suspending its formal participation at the UN brokered talks in protest at escalating violence. Nevertheless, in the spirit of cooperation, Syria has said that it is ready to discuss forming a new unity government, the red line being Assad's departure. In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss the peace talks and its future and whether there lies a real chance to resolve this crisis.
To bring back
the indirect peace talks between the Syrian government and opposition in Geneva faced a major obstacle after the Saudi High Negotiations Committee, HNC, announced a pause in the UN brokered talks. The HNC has accused government forces of violating the truce by mobilizing troops and making military advances in the north.
Their intention to postpone their formal participation in the Palais to the negotiations in order to express their own displeasure and concern on the humanitarian situation degradation and on the problems related to the cessation of hostilities.
Nearly 100 militant groups have signed up to the truce, but the ceasefire doesn't include the ISIL and other terrorist groups fighting in Syria. Many, however, believe that chances of a breakthrough in the talks would be slim, as disagreements between the rival sides remain deep. The third round of talks this year was due to focus on a political transition, but the rival sides remain at odds on the fate of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The opposition has been demanding that Assad be given no role in Syria's future. It's also said it wants the army and the security apparatus to be restructured. On the other hand, the Syrian government's chief negotiator, Bashar Jafari, has accused the Saudi-backed HNC of trying to bring the country to a collapse and repeat the chaos in Iraq and Libya and Syria.
The Saudi delegation has no right to monopolize power and claim to represent all the delegations of the Syrian opposition. If they don't want to participate, they're free not to do so. But they're not allowed to make that decision on behalf of the other sides wishing to continue in intra-Syrian talks without foreign intervention and without any preconditions.
Jafari announced that Assad's future is not up for discussion in the Geneva talks. He says the president's fate is an internal matter, and that the solution to the 5-year war is an expanded national government, which should include Assad. He's also made it clear that the Syrian government wants the army to remain in place and state institutions to continue to function to avoid any constitutional vacuum. In recent months, Syrian forces backed by Russian airstrikes have been making advances against the Daesh terrorists in the north. The operation there aims to push the terrorists out of their strongholds and choke them up by cutting their supply routes from neighboring Turkey. Daesh has already lost 30% of its income, and many of its members have defected due to lost territory and revenue. The 5-year war in Syria has left more than 250,000 people dead and displaced millions. Many fear that failure to reach a comprehensive agreement in Geneva could once again embolden extremist groups and pose a grave threat to the region and beyond.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. Paris correspondent for American Herald Tribune, Gearóid Ó Colmáin, joins us from Paris. We have journalist and political commentator Richard Millett, who joins us from London. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both. Gearóid Ó Colmáin, I'll start with you. The ceasefire is quickly unraveling. At this point, we also have the peace talks that show that they are in trouble, maybe suspended because, the latest reports indicating only 3 delegates from the opposition have showed up, and they've actually asked for the suspension, or pause as they like to call it. We have the Syrian lead negotiator criticizing the main opposition High Negotiations Committee, backed by Saudi Arabia, for suspending its formal participation at the UN brokered talks. So all of this is pointing towards basically this unraveling very quickly. Why do you think that this is happening at this time? Well, let me go to Richard Millett. Richard Millett, if you heard my question, your answer.
Well, both sides are blaming each other for breaching the ceasefire that has, to an extent, held since mid-February. And I think the most worrisome thing that we've heard is what was stated in your report, is that Syria, the Syrian regime won't allow, it's protecting Assad. It won't allow any government to be formed in the future without the President Assad being involved. And for someone that this whole civil war started with a democratic uprising, and however many have been killed, there is that spirit within the Syrian people for some sort of democracy. Now, the fact that 250,000 people at least have been killed and millions displaced isn't going to suppress that desire for democracy. So to see the Syrian regime say, hey, whatever we're going to negotiate in Geneva, nothing is going to happen to Assad, it is leading to the idea, well, there's no point of having any negotiations. If there's not going to be any elections, any democratic process, then I think the opposition is so disheartened that there's no reason to continue the negotiations. And unfortunately, from Geneva, this is having repercussions back in Syria with the continuing of the increase of the violence.
Well, when we talk about the opposition, let me ask you something, Richard Millett. Are you aware of Jaish al-Islam?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, what is their role?
Well, I mean, they're presumably part of their opposition to the regime, the fighting against Syria.
Okay, let me get your reaction to what Mohamed Alouche has said. He's a member of the so-called High Negotiations Committee. It's an umbrella group that's backed by the Saudis. And he wrote on his Twitter account, "Don't trust the regime, hit them at their necks, strike them everywhere."
Well, yes, I mean, obviously that you can't condone talk like that, but on the other side of it, they are involved in a war, and unfortunately they have lost thousands and thousands of their brothers and sisters in this terrible war. But there's also, you know, those are words, but on the other side you've had Assad, who's been hitting his people, all the opposition groups, with barrel bombs and starvation techniques and complete and utter violence as well. So obviously there's going to be horrendous words spoken on both sides and horrendous acts taking place on both sides, as we've seen with the massacre of over 250,000 people and the displacement of up to half the country, and the deaths as these people tried to approach Europe in the seas surrounding Europe. And so we know that this kind of words are going to take place, and unfortunately this happens in a war. It's not to be condoned at all, but the violence has to stop.
Well, something has happened. Gearóid Ó Colmáin, welcome. And I'd like to ask you, what has happened to make the situation unravel as quickly as it did? Because a few weeks back, when that ceasefire was announced and both the U.S. and Russia said this is going to happen, it sure enough did. And there were many who were skeptical of it. And then you had the peace talks occur, but then in a matter of days practically, it seems like everything is falling apart. What has happened?
They don't want to respect the UN Resolution 2254, which stipulates that there should be more participation in the negotiations in Geneva by other opposition groups. In other words, opposition groups who are not controlled by the Saudis. The Saudis have taken over the peace talks, and the Saudis don't want peace in Syria, and it's as simple as that. That's why they're walking out of the talks. The modus operandi of the terrorists in Syria, since snipers opened fire on police officers in the town of Dara on the 17th of March 2011, which started the war, the modus operandi of the opposition has been to blame their own crimes on the Syrian Arab Army and the government. 99% of the atrocities and the war crimes and the crimes against humanity of this war have been committed by these people. They have no representation in Syria. They do not represent any interests in Syria other than scattered oligarchs who spend most of their time living it up in Western hotels and taking orders from NATO and the Gulf Cooperation Council. They do not want to negotiate with a legitimate sovereign nation state like Syria because they do not have anything to negotiate on. They do not actually represent any interests other than the interests of those foreign countries. President Assad has stated categorically that the first thing that is necessary for the Geneva Conference is to state principles, the principles of negotiation. There will be no resignation by President Assad. That is out of the question. The Russians have confirmed that. The opposition must respect the sovereignty of the Syrian people. If they decide to create a new constitution, then that will be put to the vote in Syria, and the Syrian people will decide on that. There will be no transitional body. That is nonsense. A sovereign state cannot be run by a transitional body. The government of Syria is the legitimate entity ruling that country under international law. That cannot be part of the negotiation process. The Syrian government have been very clear about that. The Russians have been very clear about that. There are other factors I'd like to mention here. There are other powers now who are getting far more involved in this conflict than previously. China has just created a special envoy to Syria. That is highly significant because China is also fighting a war against Islamist terrorists in Xinjiang province backed by the United States, the Uyghur terrorists there, and there are many Uyghur terrorists in Syria. So China now has a special envoy in Syria, and China has expressed the desire to see an end to the conflict. There will be lots of Chinese investment in the reconstruction of Syria. That's already taking place, of course. India has had meetings with the Syrian government recently and have extended their operations, their trade relations with the country as well. Other countries, even in Europe, have re-established closer diplomatic links with Syria. You have, for example, the Czech Republic. The Syrian Deputy Foreign Minister, Faisal Mikdad, is to go to the Czech Republic in the coming days to discuss counter-terrorism measures. The Czech Republic is a member of NATO. The United States has expressed reservation about the Czech Republic's commitment to their aggressive wars, and this is another factor where you have NATO members now expressing a desire to end this war, to stop the terrorism. So the balance of power in the world has shifted towards the BRICS countries. It has shifted towards this alliance of countries who want to see peace, who want to see progress, who want to see economic development. And the Takfiri terrorists and their Israeli and Saudi backers, their days are numbered, and that is why they will not negotiate, because, of course, they can't negotiate. How can you negotiate with terrorists? These people only serve power and money.
Richard Millett, so it's a crowded field if what our guest there is saying is actually accurate. And I noticed your confusion. I myself am actually surprised by some of those statements, not saying that I feel one way or another about it. But what I gathered overall, Gearóid Ó Colmáin, correct me if I'm wrong, and my question is to Richard Millett, is that most of these countries that he talked about, our guests there, are opening towards the Syrian governments, which, as our guest there said, is a legitimate government at this point. So it seems like the tables are being turned against one of the main sponsors of this war, and that's Saudi Arabia. But overall, what's your reaction to Gearóid Ó Colmáin's statements, Richard Millett?
Well, I mean, this is not a valid regime. Assad hasn't been democratically elected for many, many years. He holds hoax elections when he's already killed thousands of his own people and up to half the country is displaced. You can't have proper elections in that situation. You can't really have any proper elections at the moment because obviously Syria is in such disarray. And this, as I said at the beginning, this was all caused by democratic uprising, the Arab Spring, which was taking place across the Arab world, starting in Tunisia, then in Egypt, and obviously we saw the repercussions. Certain Arab governments were swept away, never to be seen again, and this is what exactly happened in Syria in 2011, and obviously Assad was worried for his own existence and his government's existence. He was worried about being swept away like the other governments in the region, and he opened fire and to protect himself. He refused to go, and we've seen the bloodshed that has continued ever since. So to kind of hear this defence of Assad, if he had stepped down and there had been some sort of democracy, then into the vacuum, we wouldn't have seen Islamic State step in with all its disgusting ramifications. To hear this kind of defence of a butcher who is being supported by Iran and Hezbollah, yes, Saudi Arabia shouldn't be supplying any weapons to the opposition at all. But without supplying weapons to the opposition, there would be massacres on the scale that even more. I mean, we know that the Assad family has formed in 1982. His father massacred 20,000 innocent people in Syria, in one town, Hama. So there is form within this Assad family, and it's not surprising that this civil war has taken place, because the Syrians want to see the end of this regime. Then once he's gone, maybe a more moderate regime can fight Islamic State, and then maybe the Syrian people can get their country back. Now, to say that Assad is going to continue, that's not going to happen.
Well, that's the whole thing there. There's no replacements, Richard Millett. Gearóid Colmáin, is there replacements, as people would like to think? Because obviously that's one of the thrusts of, one of the reasons anyways for the continuation of what is happening. But more importantly, let's look at really, Gearóid Colmáin, since we're running quickly out of time. If you were to pick the countries that this war revolves around, I'm guessing it would be Saudi Arabia, the United States, Russia, and Iran. Shouldn't these four countries sit down together and talk about this, try to resolve it? Do you think that would work?
It depends on whether the Americans are going to be able to put sufficient pressure on the Saudis to actually negotiate. You also have Turkey. Turkey is a major player in this, and look at the problems they're having with Russia. I mean, they're still openly backing ISIS. They're still openly backing terrorists in Syria. Even the Israelis, who are, the fons et origo, if you like, of this entire war, even they've admitted that their colleagues in Turkey have been backing ISIS. The Israelis, of course, have said that they would prefer to see ISIS taking over Syria than Assad. So that, they all talk about human rights and democracy has absolutely no significance here as far as the Western military alliance is concerned. So the Saudi regime, of course, is a puppet regime. It takes its orders from the United States. They're not actually allowed to sell those weapons to any other country or groups without US permission. So everything the Saudis everything the Saudi regime is doing, rather, in the Middle East is on US orders and with US consent. So the big question here is whether the US and Israel want peace in Syria. Does Israel want peace with anyone? That's the real question. I doubt it very much.
Okay, let's address that. I'm sorry to jump in. Let's address that to Richard Millett. Richard Millett, answer to that if you have it, and also the part that our guest talked about how made the relationship and connection between Israel and ISIS, or ISIL, as we like to call them.
Well, obviously, I have never heard, I have heard such rubbish, and that is probably at the extreme end of the rubbish I've ever heard in my entire life. I don't think my colleague could ever even back up his statement, so we can just call that for what it is, a total and utter lie, because Israel would obviously like peace. Israel doesn't want to see any bloodshed at all, certainly not on its own borders. Look, you're right what you said, that Russia and Saudi and Iran, they all have to get around the table. And we saw there was evidence of this, that Saudi Arabia is trying to call for Iran to be involved in the oil stabilisation programme. They had a meeting over the weekend. Saudi Arabia's called for Iran. Iran refused. So, there is a possibility there. There is a handout there from Saudi Arabia to Iran. And Saudi Arabia and Iran are the two most important players because they're both supporting each side. Iran is keeping the butcher Assad in power, and Saudi is, as you said, supporting the opposition. So those two countries have to get together and have to come to some sort of agreement, and that is the only way that bloodshed can be stopped.
Okay, last question, Gearóid Ó Colmáin. We know that there's a rift that has occurred between Saudi Arabia and the United States. I'm not too sure to what degree this rift is, but based on the 9/11 connection there, and of course Saudis threatening to pull their assets out of the United States, U.S. President Barack Obama is going to be going to Saudi Arabia. Do you think that if this rift is as deep as it may appear, that there may be some parting of ways when it comes to the game plan of both the U.S. and Saudi Arabia when it comes to Syria, meaning a parting of ways on the way they're approaching the conflict?
Well, it is difficult to tell. I mean, it would be interesting if we saw a split between the United States and Israel due to Israel's role in 9/11. But it's much easier to scapegoat countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which the US tends to do when they have diplomatic disputes with Saudi Arabia. The Saudi regime, of course, is entirely dependent on the United States. But let's remember that the Saudis have signed military agreements with Israel. The Israelis are helping out in the genocide against the people of Yemen. So Israel is the key figure here in terms of the power, because if you look at the demands of the Saudis in Syria, they're basically demanding Balkanization. They want a federalization of the country, and they want to take over a lot of the Kurdish militants in that country as well. So the plan, if you like, that is being pushed by the Saudis is an Israeli plan. The Saudi regime is a Zionist regime. It was set up during the creation of Israel, backed by the United States. It has always served the same purposes of Israel. In other words, dividing and conquering the Arabs and the Muslims of the Middle East on behalf of imperialism. So these are questions which I think would be difficult to give a clear answer right now as to whether there's going to be a major rupture between the United States and the Saudi regime. I think we're going to have to wait till the next election. If Hillary Clinton gets into power, of course, then we'll probably have something like a third world war, because she's a complete maniac. The other candidate is unpredictable, so it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I got to jump in there. Thank you very much, Paris correspondent for American Herald Tribune, Gearóid Ó Colmáin from Paris, and journalist and political commentator Richard Millett spoke to us from London. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate from Gearóid Ó Colmáin and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.